Bitter Creek squatted beneath the oppressive sun like a dying animal, its bones laid bare by years of heat, dust, and lawlessness. The wind carried a fine grit that clung to every surface, turning faces gray and leaving throats raw. Red rock mesas loomed in the distance, their jagged silhouettes guarding this forsaken scrap of frontier where men either bowed to the strong or disappeared into shallow graves. The town itself was a scatter of bleached wood buildings, leaning boardwalks, and shuttered windows. Even in daylight, it felt like a place built for hiding. Secrets buried beneath dry earth and whispered warnings passed over cracked lips. The Bitter Creek Saloon stood at the heart of it all, a warped two-story structure with broken shutters and a porch that moaned under the weight of its own neglect. Its windows were smeared with dust, its swing doors faded and scuffed by countless boots. Inside, whiskey flowed like water, and men nursed old grudges with loaded pistols within reach. Life here wasn't measured in days, but in moments between violence. A glance held too long, a word spoken too sharp, and somewhere in the distance, the high, eerie cry of a hawk circled above, the only witness to sins committed under the relentless western sun. At the center of this decaying world was Clint Mosley, broad-shouldered and thick with the kind of muscle built from branding irons and broken men. Clint was Bitter Creek's self-appointed king. His ranch, the Iron Spur, owned most of the grazing land and half the able-bodied men in town. The other half worked for him, whether they wanted to or not. Clint's face was carved from stone, his eyes as empty as the dried-up riverbed north of town. When he drank, which was often, his temper flared like wildfire through dry sage. His favorite target was his wife, Mary, once a girl of sun-bright hair and laughing eyes. Now she was a ghost in threadbare calico, her skin pale and stretched over sharp cheekbones. Her belly, heavy with child, did little to shield her from Clint's fists and boot. He'd strike her in front of the townsfolk, in the middle of Main Street if it suited him. That morning, with the sun climbing high, Clint grabbed her by the arm outside the general store, dragging her into the street as onlookers pretended to see nothing. "You think you can hide money from me, woman?" Clint roared, his voice thick with whiskey. "I didn't. I swear, Clint." Mary's voice was small, brittle as dry leaves. His hand came down hard across her face, sending her sprawling to the dust. No one moved. The town marshal, a slack-jawed drunk, stood leaning against a post outside the saloon, staring down at his boots as though fascinated by the scuffed leather. Clint raised his boot, ready to stomp her belly where his own child grew. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the bystanders, but no one stepped forward. In Bitter Creek, fear was thicker than blood. It was then a rider appeared on the far end of town, moving through the shimmering heat like a ghost out of legend. His horse, a dark stallion with a sweat-matted mane, kicked up puffs of dust with each step. The man sat tall in the saddle, his face obscured by the brim of a battered, sweat-stained hat. A long coat, bleached and frayed at the edges, hung from his shoulders. The stranger guided his mount to a slow stop in front of the saloon. His gloved hand rested loosely on the horn of his saddle as he surveyed the street. Townsfolk fell silent, shifting uncomfortably. There was something about the way the man sat, the stillness of him, like a coiled rattlesnake waiting to strike. "Who's that?" someone whispered. "Could be just another drifter," another man muttered, though his voice trembled. But old men by the door of the saloon exchanged uneasy glances. A name ghosted between them, Cutter. Samuel Cutter. A name spoken in the old days, when lawmen still roamed these parts and outlaws bled in the dust. Cutter had been a ranger, or so the stories went. One who didn't flinch at hunting men to the ends of the frontier. Some said he'd died chasing the Larkson gang into the Badlands years back. Others swore he'd vanished, eaten up by the same darkness he hunted. Now here he was, flesh and blood and coated in dust. Samuel Cutter swung down from his horse, his boots landing with a dull thud on the dry earth. He loosened the strap of the rifle slung across his back, his hand never far from the worn grip of his revolver. His gaze swept the street and fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Clint standing over a fallen, pregnant woman, his boot poised to strike. The air seemed to thicken. A bead of sweat trickled down the marshal's temple. Even Clint hesitated, sensing something had shifted. Cutter didn't speak. Not yet. He stood still, eyes shadowed beneath his hat brim, reading the town like a tracker reading the dust. He saw fear in every face, cowardice in every turned shoulder. A tug at his coat sleeve made him glance down. A small, dirt-smudged girl with tangled hair stared up at him. She couldn't have been more than 7. "He's gonna kill her, mister," she whispered. Samuel Cutter looked back toward Clint Mosley. The rancher was grinning now, relishing the attention. Cutter's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He knew this kind of man too well. "All right," Cutter murmured, just loud enough for the girl to hear. "Not today." He took a step forward. Bitter Creek lived under Clint Mosley's heel. The man's reach stretched farther than the fences of the iron spur. He owned half the land, most of the cattle, and every man with a family to feed or a weakness for cheap whiskey. The saloon was his court, the bottle his scepter. He kept a marshal in his pocket with a steady supply of coin and liquor, and any man fool enough to stand against him ended up floating in the creek or buried under unmarked dirt. Doc Hartley, gray-bearded and tired, longed for better days, but kept his head down. He'd seen what happened to folks who didn't. The scar on his jaw, earned years ago when Clint's men beat him for tending to a runaway ranch hand, was a daily reminder. The widow Martha Jane ran the boarding house at the edge of town. She carried herself with a dignity the place hadn't seen in years, but even she had learned when to stay silent. Rumor was Clint had once made a move on her, and she'd paid the price with a split lip and a burned barn. Since then, she kept to herself, nursing small hopes that one day the town would rise. But hoping and acting were different things in Bitter Creek. Every man in town nursed his own quiet fears. Some owed Clint money. Others carried debts in the form of sickly wives or hungry children. The iron spur's grip wasn't just made of fists. It was the sort that twisted around a man's throat until he convinced himself he liked the feel of it. And so, when Clint raised his hand, no one looked. When he dragged Mary into the street, no one spoke. It had been that way for years, and most figured it would be that way, till the dust took them all. Mary lay on her side in the dirt outside the general store long after the crowd dispersed, blood from a split lip mixed with dust, and her child turned inside her like a restless storm. She'd once dreamed of leaving Bitter Creek. There were places beyond the mesas, places with trees, lakes so wide you couldn't see the other side. She'd imagined naming her child after the first bird she saw there, whether it was a blue jay or a crow. But those dreams were long dead. In the small hours of dusk, while Clint lay passed out in the saloon, Mary slipped from their house, the ache in her ribs sharp with every step. She made it past the last house on Main Street, her bare feet raising tiny clouds of dust as she fled toward the open desert. The sun hung low, painting the land in blood-orange light. She didn't think about where she was going, only that each step took her farther from him. It wasn't long before the riders found her. 3 of Clint's men, whooping like coyotes, ran her down before she could make it to the dry wash. They circled her, laughing, one snatching at her hair while another mocked her swollen belly. It was a game to them, dragging her back while she screamed into the empty dusk. They made sure the town saw, forcing her down Main Street like a prize animal, dust caking her bloodied face. When Clint emerged from the saloon shadow, he grinned like a man welcoming home a lost dog. He reached for his belt buckle, but before he could move another step, a voice cut the air like a blade. "Take one more step," the voice drawled, low and steady, "and you won't walk again." The street fell silent. Samuel Cutter stood there, a few paces from the saloon doors, hand resting easy on the worn grip of his revolver. The brim of his hat shadowed his face, but there was no mistaking the cold promise in his words. Clint's eyes narrowed, a cruel smirk curling his lip. "You must be one of them dime novel heroes," he sneered, spreading his arms wide. "Think you're gonna clean up Bitter Creek, huh, stranger?" Samuel didn't answer. His eyes never left Clint's. The men who dragged Mary dropped their grins, shifting uneasily. "You'll get your chance, old man," Clint growled, spitting a gob of tobacco-stained spit at the dust. "Sundown. Right here in the street. I'll put you down like a lame mule." "I'll be here," Samuel said, his voice like dry leather. The townsfolk who'd gathered shrank back, hearts pounding. It had been years since anyone challenged Clint Mosley. Sundown had always been a word for ending days, not men. But now, for the first time in Bitter Creek's long memory, it meant both. Clint turned, grabbing Mary by the hair one last time before shoving her aside. "I hope you watch, girl," he snarled. "See what happens to men who mouth off in my town." He swaggered back into the saloon, his men trailing behind, though none met Cutter's gaze as they passed. As night stretched its long fingers over Bitter Creek, a heavy hush fell. The streets emptied. Doors were bolted, shutters latched. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Mary huddled in the livery stable, hidden behind stacks of hay. Widow Martha Jane brought her a scrap of bread and a clean rag for her bruises, but said nothing of what might come. No one dared. Inside the saloon, Clint drank himself deeper into a rage, boasting of the stranger he'd kill come dawn. He laughed too loud, slapped his men on the back, but a shadow clung to the corners of the room. Outside of town, Samuel Cutter sat beneath a skeletal juniper tree, his rifle laid across his knees. The fire's glow lit the hardened lines of his face. In the distance, a coyote's lonely call echoed through the night. Memories crept in, unbidden and sharp. A cabin by a creek long ago. A woman with hair like midnight and a laugh that could turn the worst day sweet. A little boy chasing fireflies in the dark. Then fire. Gunshots. Smoke rising to a starless sky. The faces of the Larkson gang burned into his mind, their crude laughter as they rode away. He'd hunted them for years. Found them one by one, the last of them buried in shallow graves across 3 territories. And when it was done, Cutter had disappeared into the wild, leaving his badge and the world behind. Until now. Bitter Creek was no accident. He'd followed word of Clint Mosley, the kind of man who made his living off fear, whose sins stained the ground like old blood. He watched the town lights flicker out, one by one, the final promise of the old law about to come due. Cutter picked up his rifle and checked the chamber. 5 rounds. 5 was enough. The sky turned black and endless, and Bitter Creek waited for dawn. Dawn came slow to Bitter Creek, the first thin light stretching long shadows across the dust-caked street. The air was brittle, every sound sharp as a knife edge in the hush before the sun cracked the horizon. Even the wind seemed to wait, holding its breath for what was coming. The saloon doors banged open with a burst of noise and the stench of last night's whiskey. Clint Mosley stumbled out into the cold gray morning, eyes bloodshot, revolver swinging in his fist. His shirt was stained, his face twisted in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Where's that sake Bones?" he called out, voice raw. "Cutter, I'm here, you gutless bastard." From the far end of the street, Samuel Cutter stepped out of the shadows beside the livery. His coat moved with the faintest breeze, his wide-brimmed hat throwing a long, dark line across the dirt. He said nothing. The townsfolk, roused by the commotion, gathered at windows, behind barrels, from alleyways, their faces tight with fear and something older, hope. Clint swayed in place, his boots scraping the dirt. "You got one chance, old man. Turn around, ride out of here, and maybe I'll let you keep your hide." Samuel's voice came low and even. "I told you, Mosley. One more step." Clint's grin twitched. "Hell with you." He raised his revolver and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust near Cutter's boots. Before the echo faded, Samuel's hand moved, his Colt cleared leather in a smooth, practiced draw, the report cracking like thunder in the still dawn. Clint's knee exploded in a spray of blood and bone. He went down screaming, dropping his revolver, clutching his leg as his body twisted in the dirt. A woman shrieked from somewhere. A dog barked. The silence shattered. From the saloon, Clint's men burst into the street, pistols drawn. A dozen of them, maybe more, faces pale beneath their wide hats, eyes bloodshot from drink. For a half-second they hesitated, seeing their boss writhing in the dirt, but then rage took hold. "Kill him," one roared. Guns flared. Muzzle flashes burst like lightning against the morning gloom. Bullets tore splinters from posts, punched holes in shutters. Samuel ducked behind a water trough as lead sang past his head. His rifle was in his hands, the first shot dropping a man mid-run. sending him sprawling lifeless into the dust. Another round cracked from the far side of the street. Doc Hartley, crouched behind a hitching rail, his hands trembling but his aim steady, sent a slug through the shoulder of a gunman. Blood splattered the saloon wall. Widow Martha Jane appeared at the corner of the boarding house, a fallen rifle gripped tight against her chest. Her first shot missed, but the second took a man square in the chest, dropping him like a sack of grain. A ripple ran through the town. Ordinary men and women, men who'd once flinched at Clint's name, women who'd crossed streets to avoid his gaze, now grabbed drop pistols and broken shotguns. What began as a desperate stand turned into a sudden uprising. One of Clint's men charged at Samuel with a raised knife. Cutter's revolver barked twice, the man pitching forward without a sound. Another went for cover behind a rain barrel, only to take a round from Martha Jane, who chambered another cartridge with the cold precision of someone settling old debts. It wasn't long before the gang's numbers thinned. 2 fled on foot, vanishing between buildings. 3 more lay in the street. Blood darkened the dust. The gunfight that should have left Bitter Creek cowering had instead woken something the town had buried for years. In the lull, a wounded gang member slumped against the saloon's outer wall, clutching a bleeding shoulder. His face twisted in pain and fear as his gaze lifted to Samuel. "Cutter," he rasped, half a curse, half a prayer. "That's Samuel Cutter, the ranger." The words carried, heavy as a tombstone. The faces at the windows changed. Eyes widened. Old men exchanged looks, their memories unearthing stories whispered over campfires. Of the ranger who'd hunted the Larkson gang across 6 territories, who'd stood alone against a dozen men in a canyon gulch and walked away with blood on his hands and not a scratch on him. The man who vanished after his wife and son were murdered by outlaws and swore no badge or law would bind him again. And here he was. Memories flickered through Samuel's mind too. The screaming of his wife, the thick black smoke from their burning cabin, his son's small, lifeless body cradled in his arms. The endless years of pursuit, of blood spilled in retribution, of miles ridden with death always one step behind. The street was quiet now, save for the moaning of the wounded and the wind stirring loose dust. Clint Mosley lay in the dirt, his leg a ruin, blood turning the earth to mud beneath him. His revolver lay inches from his hand. He reached for it, trembling, his face a mask of hate and fear. A soft shuffle of footsteps sounded behind him. Mary stepped from the livery's shadow, a pistol in her hand. Her face was pale, bruised. Her lips split, but her eyes were clear. She raised the weapon, pointing it at Clint's head. "You killed my baby," she said, her voice shaking but steady. Clint coughed blood, sneering. "You ain't got it in you." Mary's finger tightened on the trigger. Tears blurred her vision. The weapon shook. Samuel stepped beside her, his presence calm, unyielding. "You don't owe him another drop of your soul," he said softly. For a long, fragile moment, Mary hesitated. Then slowly, she lowered the pistol. "Leave him to you," she whispered. Cutter nodded once. Without a word, he raised his revolver and fired. The final shot echoed through Bitter Creek, bouncing off the weathered buildings, carrying with it the last breath of Clint Mosley's reign. The sun crested the horizon, casting long golden light across the blood-stained dust. The town stood silent, and Bitter Creek began to breathe again. The morning light painted Bitter Creek in a shade it hadn't worn in years. Blood-darkened dust stained the main street, spent shells glinted in the dirt, and the bitter smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Yet, in that silence after the storm, a new kind of stillness settled over the town, not one of fear, but of stunned relief. Men who'd spent years looking over their shoulders now stood in the open, blinking at the dawn like men seeing it for the first time. Doc Hartley moved between the wounded, his old hands steady despite the blood. He patched torn flesh and bound bullet wounds with strips of linen, the lines in his weathered face softened by something that might have been hope. The bodies of Clint Mosley's gang lay where they'd fallen. A few townsfolk, emboldened by the rising sun, dragged them into a heap at the edge of town. No one said a word about where they might be buried, or if they deserved burying at all. Mary, bruised and pale, was led gently into Martha Jane's boarding house. The older woman cleaned the blood from her face with soft hands and quiet murmurs. Mary barely spoke, though her eyes stayed clear, watching the light shift through the cracked window, as if realizing she'd lived through something she wasn't meant to survive. Martha Jane brought her broth, laid cool cloths on her brow, and sat with her long into the morning. The rest of Bitter Creek, slowly, haltingly, began to move again. Shutters opened. Children peeked around corners. Men gathered in twos and threes, not in secret, but in open conversation. Voices hushed not from fear, but from the heavy weight of a world changed overnight. Samuel Cutter stood alone in the street for a while after the last shot faded, revolver still holstered, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He said nothing to the townsfolk, nor did they approach him. He wasn't one of them. He never would be. And that was just as well. By noon, Cutter had saddled his horse and ridden out to a low hill a mile outside town, where the wind moved through dry grass and scattered rocks like a whispered hymn. Two small graves sat side by side beneath a weathered cottonwood tree, their stones worn by years of dust and rain. One bore the name Elena Cutter, the other simply Jacob. He dismounted slowly, the aches in his body speaking of hard years and longer miles. In his hand, he carried a small bundle, an old, tarnished ranger badge wrapped in oilskin. He knelt beside the graves, his fingers tracing the worn letters as though they were still new. "I told you I'd see it through," he murmured, his voice carrying only to the wind. "Took me too damn long, but it's done now." He unwrapped the badge and set it on Elena's grave, the dull metal catching the sunlight for a brief moment before resting in shadow. "I ain't fixin' to stay," he said, as though she might be listening. "This place'll heal. Not me." For a while he sat in silence, watching the sky turn the color of faded bone. Then, without ceremony, he stood, mounted his horse, and turned back toward town. In the weeks that followed, Bitter Creek began to shed its skin. With Clint Mosley dead and his men either buried or scattered, the town no longer carried itself with the heavy, fearful gait it once had. Men walked with their shoulders straighter. The saloon, once a den of Mosley's rule, passed into the hands of Martha Jane, who scrubbed the blood from its floorboards and its past from its walls. She reopened it as a place of laughter and music, where a man could drink without having to look over his shoulder. Doc Hartley took on an apprentice, a boy from the edge of town with a steady hand and a sharp mind. He spoke often of how the old days were gone, and for once, nobody disagreed. Mary's child came early, a small, fierce little thing with his mother's dark hair. She named him Samuel, though no one spoke the name too loud. It carried a weight now, not of fear, but of something harder and truer, of a promise kept. The town repaired its fences. Livestock returned to abandoned fields. Even the church bell, silent for years, rang again one Sunday morning as a prayer of sorts, not for the dead, but for the living who still had miles ahead of them. And Cutter? He stayed long enough to see the dust settle, and the first good rain in months darken the dirt roads. When he left, it was without farewell. He rode out at dusk, his silhouette a black shape against a sky bleeding orange and red. The wind tugged at his coat, and the land stretched ahead, empty and wild, just the way he liked it. A small figure stood at the edge of town, the same dirt-smudged girl who'd tugged his coat that first day. She lifted a hand in farewell. He tipped his hat to her, a small, rough smile crossing his weathered face. Some men die legends, their names carved into stone and stories. And some, like Cutter, keep riding, carrying the weight of justice into places no lawman dares follow. And as the crimson sky swallowed him whole, Bitter Creek was left with something it hadn't known in years: peace.